The words hit Nora Harper like a fist to the chest. She had been standing at the workbench in the livery stable, hands deep in a bucket of linseed oil and rough leather, when she overheard them talking on the other side of the thin plank wall. Two men, their voices low and conspiratorial, the kind of low that meant they knew exactly what they were saying and exactly how wrong it was. "Fletcher's going to lose that land," the first voice said. It was Cass Denton. She recognized it immediately, that thick drawl with the meanness coiled inside every syllable. The deed's already been filed under Holt's name. By the time Fletcher figures out the trap, it'll be too late to do a single thing about it. And the woman, the second voice she did not recognize, she's the one who brought the papers. Whether she knows it or not, she's the reason he's about to lose everything. Nora's hand stopped moving. The oil went still in the bucket. Her heart did something she had not felt it do in a very long time, which was crack open along an old seam that she had spent 3 years carefully sealing shut, because she did know. She knew exactly what papers they were talking about. She had carried them from Abilene in a leather satchel tucked under the bench seat of the eastbound stage. She had been paid $20 to deliver them to a man named Holt in Cassidy Creek, and she had not asked what was inside because $20 was $20 when you were a woman alone in 1882, with a horse that needed rishad and a stomach that had forgotten what a full meal tasted like. She had delivered those papers 4 days ago. She had not known, until this exact moment, standing in the acrid warmth of someone else's livery stable with oil-dark hands and a secret burning a hole through her ribs, that she had handed over a man's entire life. And not just any man. Milton Fletcher, the only man in the state of Kansas who had looked at her since she arrived in Cassidy Creek without any calculation in his eyes, without the particular kind of appraisal that men applied to women traveling alone, sizing them up for what use they might be. He had looked at her the way people looked at the horizon, with something that was neither hunger nor dismissal, but simply a kind of steady recognition, as though he had always expected her to appear there eventually. She had to tell him. The thought arrived with such ferocious clarity that it pushed everything else sideways. She had to tell him what she had done, what she had unknowingly carried into this town, and she had to do it before Holt moved on that deed, and before the trap closed around a man who did not deserve to have his life dismantled by her ignorance. She wiped her hands on the rough canvas apron, untied it from her waist, folded it with a kind of deliberate calm that was entirely at odds with the chaos banging around behind her sternum, and walked out of the livery into the brutal September sun of the Kansas plains. 3 years before she stood in that livery with oil-dark hands and a secret eating her alive, Nora Harper had been a schoolteacher in Lawrence, Kansas, with a small rented room above a milliner's shop and a reasonable expectation that her life would proceed in an orderly and unremarkable fashion. She had been 25 years old and teaching the children of farmers and merchants their letters and their numbers, and she had been content, if not precisely happy, in the way that women who have learned not to want too much are sometimes content. She had a few friends, a shelf of books she read and reread, and a man named Daniel Cruz who came to call on Sunday afternoons and spoke to her with the kind of gentle condescension that she had not yet learned to identify as a warning sign. Daniel Cruz had a dark past that he kept carefully folded out of sight, the way you fold a letter you cannot bring yourself to burn. He was charming and handsome, and he had a gambler's gift for telling people exactly what they most needed to hear. What Nora needed to hear at 25, after years of careful self-sufficiency and watchful distance from the world, was that she was seen, that she was known, that someone had looked at her and chosen her deliberately, not from necessity or convenience but from genuine desire. Daniel told her all of those things. He told her she was extraordinary. He told her he had never met a woman with her particular combination of intelligence and warmth. He told her he intended to marry her as soon as he had settled certain business affairs in Missouri. The business affairs in Missouri turned out to be a wife and 2 children he had failed to mention. When Nora found out, which she did not find out gently or privately, but in the most humiliating fashion imaginable, standing in the post office when Daniel's actual wife walked in and recognized his name on a letter Nora was posting to him, the world she had been quietly constructing for herself did not simply collapse. It inverted. Every memory she had rearranged itself into evidence of her own foolishness. Every gentle condescension she had mistaken for tenderness became instead a clear record of how little he had thought of her, how easy she had been to deceive, how thoroughly he had counted on her, not looking too carefully at the hidden machinery underneath his pretty words. She had left Lawrence within the week, not running, she told herself, relocating. There was a difference. Running implied fear. She was not afraid. She was simply finished with a place that had become unbearable through no fault of the geography. She had gone west because west was where people went when they needed to become someone the past could not easily follow. She had taken on work where she could find it, tutoring the children of ranchers for a season, keeping accounts for a dry goods store in Dodge City for another, and then the quiet years in between where she simply moved from town to town along the great flat expanse of the Kansas plains, carrying her satchel and her shelf of books, and the hard-won lesson that trust was a door you should never open without first checking very carefully what was on the other side. She had been in Cassidy Creek for 11 days when she met Milton Fletcher. She had arrived on a Tuesday with 50 cents to her name and a letter of introduction to a widow named Mrs. Garland, who was said to need a boarder and occasional help with her accounts. Mrs. Garland turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman of 60 with no patience for sentimentality and a strong preference for people who could carry their own weight without complaint, which suited Nora perfectly. She had taken the back room, a small square space with a window that looked out over the scrubby edge of town where the buildings stopped and the prairie began, and she had set about making herself useful. It was on her 4th day in town, walking back from the mercantile with a sack of cornmeal balanced on one hip, that she first saw Milton Fletcher. He was standing outside the land registry office with a piece of paper in his hand, and an expression on his face that she recognized immediately and viscerally, because she had worn that expression herself in a Lawrence post office 3 years ago. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the ground beneath them is not solid, that the thing they believed was real has been quietly replaced with something false, and the substitution is so thorough and so complete that they cannot yet fully take it in. She had not spoken to him then. She had kept walking. But she had looked back once, and when she did, he was already looking in her direction, not at her specifically. She did not think, just out at the horizon the way a man does when the walls of the present moment have become briefly too small to contain him. She had found out his name from Mrs. Garland that evening. Milton Fletcher, Mrs. Garland said with the comfortable authority of a woman who had lived in a small town long enough to know everyone's history by heart, owned the Anchor Creek Ranch, which was 1,400 acres of prime grazing land, about 4 miles east of town, that his father had homesteaded in 1864, and which Milton had built into something genuinely remarkable through 18 years of deliberate, patient, unglamorous work. He was 32 years old. He had never married, though not for lack of opportunity. Mrs. Garland added with a particular kind of meaningful pause that Nora chose not to examine too closely. He was not a man given to conversation for its own sake, but he was reliable, fair with his workers, and he had what Mrs. Garland called the quality that mattered most in the territories, which was that when things went wrong, he did not look around for someone else to blame. Nora had filed this information away with the careful neutrality she applied to most information about men. Interesting, not relevant. And then she had taken a temporary job helping with deliveries for Holt's freight operation, because $20 was $20, and she had carried a leather satchel from Abilene to Cassidy Creek without asking what was inside. She crossed the main street of Cassidy Creek now with the September sun throwing her shadow long and sharp across the packed dirt, moving with purpose toward the eastern edge of town, where she knew from Mrs. Garland that Milton Fletcher kept a secondary corral when he was in town for business. She had seen his horse there twice, a big bay with one white sock on the left foreleg, too distinctive to mistake. The horse was there now. And so was Milton Fletcher, standing with his back to her at the corral fence, his arms resting along the top rail, watching his horse with the same quality of still attention she had noticed that first day outside the land registry office. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who have done physical labor their whole lives without ever making a performance of it. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the heat, because he had been working and had not bothered to make himself presentable for the simple task of checking on his horse. She stopped about 10 feet away. "Mr. Fletcher," she said. He turned. He had a direct, unhurried way of turning to face someone, as though he had decided before he started moving that whatever he was turning toward was worth the full weight of his attention. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that the prairie light in late afternoon turned almost silver, and they found her face without any of the elaborate social machinery most people used as a buffer against the unexpected. "Miss Harper," he said. He knew her name. She should not have been surprised. In a town of 300 people, everyone knew everyone's name within a week. But the fact that he had learned it and retained it, and now said it without any affectation, did something small and involuntary to the careful architecture of her neutrality. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to hear it before you react to it, because the reaction you are going to want to have is not the useful one." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Just those 2 words, "all right." No defensiveness, no preemptive posturing, no performance of skepticism. Just a simple willingness to hear what she had to say before deciding what to think about it. She told him everything. She told him about the job from Holt's freight operation, and the $20, and the satchel she had not opened, and the conversation she had overheard in the livery stable not 20 minutes ago. She told him about Cass Denton's voice, and what he had said about the deed being already filed under Holt's name, and the trap that was already closed around him. She did not apologize, because apologies in the middle of information sharing are a waste of the other person's time, and she had learned that from teaching. But she told him clearly and directly that she had been the instrument, however unwitting, of the thing that was being done to him. When she finished, Milton Fletcher did not react the way she had expected him to. She had expected anger, or at least the tight compression of anger being carefully managed. What she got instead was a long silence in which he turned back to the fence and looked at his horse again, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working through something that was not rage but was something more complicated and in some ways harder to watch. "The papers were the deed transfer documents," he said finally. "It was not a question. I believe so. And Holt has them now, already filed." "That is what Denton said." Another silence. The bay horse moved to the far side of the corral and shook its head at something only it could see. "Why are you telling me?" Milton asked. He turned back to her, and there was something in the question that was genuinely curious rather than accusatory, as though he had already absorbed the logistical information and was now interested in the more interesting question. "Because it was my error, even if it was not my intention," Nora said, "and because you deserve to know before it becomes irrevocable." He looked at her for another long moment with those silver-gray eyes that did not flinch from anything they landed on. Then he said, "What do you know about land deed fraud in Kansas?" She almost smiled. "Almost. More than I expected to," she said. "I kept accounts for a land office in Dodge City for 7 months. There are specific provisions in the 1873 Homestead Amendment about fraudulent transfers made without the original owner's knowledge or consent." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, the way a change in wind direction is subtle. You feel it before you can name exactly what changed. "You think there is a legal remedy?" "I think there might be, but it would need to move quickly, and it would need someone who knows exactly what documentation was in that satchel." She paused. And I am the one who carried it, which means I am the one who can testify to its contents, the seals, the condition of the papers, the chain of custody from Abilene. You are offering to help me. I am telling you what I know and what I can do with it, she said. What you do with that information is your decision. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking in the way that serious people think, not quickly and brilliantly but carefully and completely, turning the problem over and examining all its faces before committing to a direction. Come to the Anchor Creek tomorrow morning, he said. Early. I need to look at my own documents first and understand exactly what Holt has filed against. I will be there, she said. She turned to go. Miss Harper, he said, and she stopped. She looked back. Thank you, he said. And the way he said it was not the reflexive social politeness she had learned to hear as essentially meaningless, but something much simpler and more direct. The gratitude of someone who means exactly what they are saying and does not feel the need to ornament it. She nodded once and walked back across the September golden street toward Mrs. Garland's house, and she did not examine the particular warmth that had settled somewhere in the center of her chest, because it was not the time, and she was not the kind of person who allowed herself to be distracted by inconvenient warmth during a crisis. She told herself that very firmly all the way home. Nora rose before dawn the next morning, dressed in her practical clothes, the dark blue work dress that could survive a day's riding without looking entirely ruined, and borrowed Mrs. Garland's old sorrel mare, who was slow but steady and knew the eastern road to Anchor Creek well enough from various supply runs over the years. The sky was doing what the Kansas sky did in the hour before sunrise, which was turn colors that had no names in ordinary language, deep bruised purples bleeding into something that was neither gold nor green. And the air was cold, and carried the smell of dried grass and distant rain that had not yet arrived. She found Anchor Creek Ranch as the sun was just clearing the horizon, and the first thing she noticed was how well tended it was. Not ornate, not the kind of showy prosperity that some ranchers used to advertise their own success, but genuinely, carefully maintained in every detail. The fences were straight and tight. The buildings were weathered but sound. The yard was clear of the accumulated debris of carelessness that you saw on properties whose owners had stopped paying attention. Someone had been paying attention here for a very long time. Milton Fletcher was already outside when she rode in, which she expected. He was a man who was awake before the light came. She could see that about him the same way you can see certain things about people by the condition of the things they care for. He was carrying a wooden crate of papers from the barn to the main house, and he set it down on the porch steps when he saw her coming, and he came to take the mare's bridle while she dismounted. The files were in the barn, he said by way of explanation, gesturing at the crate. I keep the originals in a locked box in the house, but I wanted the correspondence as well. Smart, she said. They went inside. The main house was simple and functional, and had the same quality as the yard, the quality of someone living deliberately in a space, rather than merely occupying it. There was a large table in the main room that Milton had already cleared, and was now spreading documents across with the focused economy of a man who has decided on a direction, and is moving in it without waste. And then the morning happened. It was not a dramatic morning in the sense that great events occurred. What happened was that two people sat down on opposite sides of a table covered in documents and began to work, and they worked for hours with a quiet, absolute, mutual concentration that Nora had never experienced in any collaboration before. She did not speak because there was not yet anything useful to say. The first several hours were reading and sorting, understanding the shape of what Milton owned and what Holt was claiming, and where the fraudulent deed transfer had embedded itself like a sliver of metal in living tissue. Milton did not speak for the same reason. They moved around each other at the table with an instinctive, unspoken courtesy, passing documents, making room, occasionally pointing at something on a page that seemed significant and waiting while the other person read it. Once or twice, working through the same column of land registry entries, their hands came close together on the table, not touching, just near. And neither of them pulled away or made the elaborate performance of not noticing that usually happens when people are pretending not to be aware of proximity. Around the middle of the morning, one of Milton's hired men knocked on the open door and told him there was a problem with the eastern fence line. Milton looked at Nora. She looked at the papers. "I can keep going," she said. "I know what I am looking for." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried quality that she was beginning to identify as specific to him and not just to thoughtful people in general. Then he nodded and went with his man, and Nora kept working. He was gone for perhaps 2 hours. When he came back, she had sorted the entire table into a clear logical structure and had written out, on 3 sheets of paper in the careful, clear hand she had used for 7 years as a school teacher and account keeper, a complete summary of what the documents showed about Holt's fraudulent claim and exactly where the legal vulnerabilities in that claim were. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table and at her and at the papers in her hand. She handed them to him without preamble and watched him read. When he finished the 3rd page, he looked up. "This is remarkable," he said, "not flattery. Just accurate assessment, the way a man who knows good fence work recognizes it in someone else's pasture. The central problem is the signature on the deed transfer document," Nora said. "It claims to be witnessed by a clerk named Thomas Waverly at the Abilene Land Office. But from your correspondence, I found 2 letters from the Abilene Land Office dated within the same month, and they are signed by a different clerk. If Thomas Waverly did not work at the Abilene Land Office, the witnessing of the transfer is fraudulent on its face." "I need to ride to Abilene," Milton said. "You need someone to go with you who can testify to the chain of custody on the documents Holt filed," Nora said. "That someone is me." He put the papers down on the table and looked at her with the same quality of complete attention he gave to everything, and there was something in the look now that had not been there before, something that was not quite assessment and not quite gratitude, but something in between that occupied its own particular territory. "We will leave day after tomorrow," he said. "I need to make arrangements here." "I need to speak to Mrs. Garland," Nora said. "She will want to know where I am going." "Of course," he said. And then, after a moment, "It occurs to me that you have been working beside me all morning without speaking, and it is the best morning I can remember in longer than I can account for." The words landed in the quiet room with a specificity that caught her completely off guard, not because they were complimentary, but because they were true. She could feel the truth of them in the way you feel the truth of a statement that matches your own experience so precisely that it stops being language and becomes something more immediate. She looked at him. He was not looking away. He was not performing the words or softening them with a smile that would have given them a social function and robbed them of their weight. He was simply stating what was true for him, the way he stated everything, without ornament and without apology. Something in the carefully maintained architecture of Nora Harper's defenses shifted. It did not collapse. It simply shifted, the way a wall shifts when the ground underneath it has been quietly changing shape for a long time and has finally reached the point where the wall must acknowledge it. "I find that I agree with you," she said, and she meant it in both directions. The ride to Abilene took 2 days on horseback, which was the most direct way to travel in September of 1882 in central Kansas, and they left at first light on a Thursday morning with their saddlebags packed with documents and enough provision for the journey. Nora had expected the ride to be businesslike and focused on the task ahead. She had expected to maintain the professional distance she had established in the previous day's work, and to arrive in Abilene with their purpose clearly defined and their personal boundary clearly intact. She had not expected Milton Fletcher to be funny. It was a dry, self-deprecating, entirely understated humor that emerged gradually over the first few hours of riding, like a spring that only runs in certain weather. He told her, with complete deadpan seriousness, about the time he had spent an entire afternoon trying to repair a windmill and had ultimately succeeded only in making it turn in the wrong direction, which had been deeply confusing to his horses. He described his one attempt to attend a church social in town 3 years ago, during which he had spent the entire evening in a conversation about the theological implications of grain prices with the Methodist minister, and had left without speaking to a single other human being. Nora laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite social performance of amusement, but the genuine involuntary kind that catches you before you can decide whether it is appropriate. He glanced at her sideways when she laughed, not smiling exactly, but something happening around his eyes that functioned as a smile. She told him about teaching in Lawrence, about the particular chaos of 20 children between the ages of 6 and 14, all occupying the same room, about the small epic dramas of their social lives, the alliances and betrayals and passionate friendships that operated with the full emotional intensity of adult life inside miniature bodies. He listened the way he worked, with complete focused attention, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually listening. "You miss it," he said. Not a question. She considered this honestly. "I miss the children," she said. "I do not miss being a woman alone in a town where everyone has already decided what your life will be before you have had the chance to decide it yourself." He rode with this for a while. The prairie spread around them in every direction, the vast flat golden expanse of it under the September sky, and there was something about being out in the middle of all that space that made honesty easier, as though the usual social compression that required people to package their truths in protective wrapping was simply not necessary when there was so much room. "I know something about that," he said eventually. She looked at him. "People in a small town have decided what your life is going to be before you have done it," he said. "And they are not always wrong exactly, but they are always incomplete. They see the rancher, the land, the father's legacy. They do not see the rest of it." "What is the rest of it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily beneath them, and the wind came across the grass with a sound like breathing. "I read," he said, "a great deal, more than is probably useful for a man in my position." He paused. "I have opinions about novels that I have never told anyone in Cassidy Creek because I do not know how to begin that conversation in the context in which they know me." She felt the warmth again, the specific inconvenient warmth she had been carefully not examining since the previous afternoon. It was not useful to feel warmth toward a man she was riding to Abilene with on a legal errand. It was not part of the plan. "What novels?" she said, and they talked about books for the next 3 hours while Kansas rolled past them like the slowest ocean in the world. They arrived in Abilene on the evening of the first day, and took separate rooms at a boarding house near the main street, and Nora lay awake for a long time in her small, clean room listening to the sounds of the town settling into night, the distant piano from the saloon 3 streets over, the creak of the building as it cooled, and the specific quality of her own thoughts, which were considerably more turbulent than she liked. She was in trouble. She recognized it with the clarity of someone who has been in trouble before and knows the particular shape of it. This was not the trouble of the fraudulent deed and the legal errand and the trap that had been laid around an innocent man. That trouble she could navigate. She understood its shape, and she knew what to do with it. The other trouble, the warmth in the center of her chest, and the way the afternoon light had caught the side of his face when he was reading, and the particular quality of the silence they had shared across that table, that was the kind of trouble she had sworn she was done with. That was the kind of trouble that had cost her Lawrence, Kansas, and 3 years of careful, deliberate, controlled solitude. "The difference," said a small, honest voice somewhere below all her careful reasoning, "is that this man has not lied to you once." She told the voice to be quiet, and eventually she slept. The next morning they went to the Abilene Land Office together, and what they found there confirmed everything Nora had theorized from the documents. The clerk, named Thomas Waverley, had not worked at the Abilene Land Office in over 2 years. He had left under circumstances that the current head clerk described with careful diplomatic opacity, but which Milton, who asked the direct questions she noticed he always asked, established clearly enough. Waverley had been dismissed for accepting payments to witness documents he had no legitimate authority to witness. The head clerk, a careful man of 40 with spectacles and the slightly hunted look of someone who had recently been given problems he did not ask for, took Milton's documentation and Nora's written testimony and asked them to return that afternoon. They had several hours. Milton bought her breakfast at a restaurant near the train depot. A real breakfast, eggs and ham and biscuits, not the traveling provisions they had been eating, and they sat across from each other in a booth with the morning light coming through a window filmed slightly with the dust of the Abilene street, and the conversation that had been threading through 2 days of riding and 1 morning of legal work continued as though no one had ever interrupted it. She told him about Daniel Cruz. She did not know exactly why she told him, except that the conversation had reached a depth where the omission of it would have been dishonest, and she had found herself constitutionally unable to be dishonest with this man in a way that troubled her as much as the warmth did. He listened to the whole thing. He did not interrupt. He did not make the reassuring noises that people make when they want to demonstrate sympathy without actually engaging with what they are hearing. He simply listened, and when she finished, he said, "That must have made it very difficult to trust anything that came after." "It did," she said. "It does." "I want you to know," he said, and he said it with the directness she had come to recognize as simply the way he operated, without any social softening or rhetorical maneuvering, "that I am not going to lie to you. I do not have hidden motives. I do not have a wife in Missouri or anywhere else. What you see when you look at me is what is actually there." She looked at him across the table with the morning light between them. "I believe you," she said. And she meant it, and the meaning of it terrified her slightly, because believing someone was the thing she had been most careful not to do, and she was doing it anyway. The way you step onto ice that you are not entirely certain will hold you because the cold has come and there is no other way across. The Abilene Land Office came through that afternoon with exactly what they needed: a certified statement from the head clerk attesting that Thomas Waverley had not been a legitimate clerk at the time the deed transfer document was witnessed, along with a formal notation in the land registry records indicating that the transfer was under investigation for fraud. It was not the final resolution. It would not be final until they returned to Cassidy Creek and presented this documentation to the county recorder, and Milton said with a grimness that had nothing theatrical in it, to Eli Holt directly, along with the clear information that the fraudulent transfer was now a matter of official record and that pursuing it further would constitute a criminal offense. But it was enough. It was the lever they needed. They rode back to Cassidy Creek the way they had come, through the great flat golden prairie under the enormous Kansas sky, and the second day's riding had a different quality than the first. They were not going toward a problem anymore. They were coming home from having partially solved one. And something in that shift, in the movement from the urgency of confrontation to the steadier ground of work completed, created a space in which things that had been carefully held at a careful distance had room to move closer. They stopped at midday near a creek where the cottonwood trees had already started to turn, their leaves going yellow and trembling in the light wind off the plains, and they watered the horses and ate from their saddlebags and sat on the bank of the creek with the specific companionable ease of 2 people who have spent 4 days in close proximity and found that the proximity has been, against all reasonable expectation, entirely comfortable. "What will you do," Milton said, "after this is resolved?" She looked at the creek. The water was clear and running low, the September drought having pulled it down from its spring height. "I have not decided," she said honestly. "I have been in Cassidy Creek 11 days. It is too soon to know whether I intend to stay." "What would make you stay?" he asked, It was a direct question, the way all his questions were direct, but it had a particular weight to it that she chose for the moment not to examine. "Useful work," she said, "and people worth knowing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The county schoolhouse has been without a teacher since last spring. The previous teacher left to get married, and they have not been able to find a replacement." She turned to look at him. "I am on the school board," he said, with the slightest possible trace of dry humor around the corners of his mouth. "I have been trying to recruit a qualified teacher for 4 months." She held his gaze for a long moment while the cottonwood leaves trembled overhead and the creek ran cool and clear over its limestone bed, and then she said, "That is not subtle, Mr. Fletcher." "No," he agreed. "I gave up subtle some years ago. It seemed like an inefficient use of time." She looked back at the water. She could feel him watching her with that steady, complete attention that she had spent 12 days carefully not letting herself respond to. And she was suddenly profoundly aware that the careful not responding had been an enormous amount of work, and that she was, at this precise moment, in a cottonwood grove in central Kansas with the man responsible for it, very tired of working so hard at something that had stopped making sense. "I will consider it," she said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the only currency that worked between them, the position and the rest of it, a pause. "The rest of it," he said, with a careful neutrality that she understood immediately was not indifference but its opposite. "Yes," she said, "the rest of it." They sat by the creek for another half-hour without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence Nora Harper had experienced in 3 years of solitude, which told her something she was not quite ready to say out loud, but which she turned over in her mind like a smooth stone all the rest of the way home. The confrontation with Eli Holt happened on a Monday morning 4 days after they returned from Abilene, and Nora was there for it, not because it required her presence, but because Milton asked her to come, and she had decided that refusing to be present for the consequences of her own involvement was the kind of evasion she did not intend to practice anymore. Holt was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a prosperous man's assumption that problems would resolve themselves in his favor simply by virtue of his being involved in them. He ran Cassidy Creek's largest freight operation and had 2 men on the town council, and he had, Nora understood from the documents they had assembled, spent the better part of 3 years methodically identifying the Anchor Creek Ranch as an acquisition target and engineering the circumstances under which he could take it. The trap he had laid was sophisticated. She would grant him that. The fraudulent deed transfer was only the visible mechanism. Underneath it was a longer strategy involving 3 separate debts that Holt had quietly purchased from various creditors, and which he had intended to call in simultaneously, once the land was legally in his name, leaving Milton with no ground to stand on and no recourse available. What Holt had not accounted for was a woman carrying his own documents who understood enough about land registry law to recognize what she was carrying, or a man who could respond to betrayal by moving toward it rather than away from it. They met in the county recorder's office, a spare functional room that smelled of ink and old paper, with the county recorder himself present as a witness, and Milton's documents laid out on the table in the clear logical order Nora had established on that long quiet morning at Anchor Creek. Holt looked at the Abilene Land Office statement. He looked at the certified record of Thomas Waverly's dismissal. He looked at the notation in the registry records indicating official investigation. He looked at Nora, who met his gaze without flinching, because she had learned somewhere in the previous 2 weeks that flinching was a choice and not an obligation. "The deed transfer is fraudulent on its face," Milton said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The witness had no legitimate authority at the time of witnessing. The Abilene Land Office has certified this. The county recorder has the documentation. If you attempt to proceed with this claim, you will be charged with deed fraud under the Kansas statutes of 1876, which carries a penalty of 5 to 10 years. Holt looked at Cass Denton, who was standing to his left, and who had the expression of a man reviewing his available exits. Furthermore, Milton continued, and there was something in his voice that was cold and very precise, not angry but beyond anger, the tone of a man who has been lied to and cheated and has processed all of it, and arrived at the side of it where the emotion is not the relevant factor. If it comes to my attention that you have taken any further action against my property, my operation, or anyone associated with me, I will pursue every available legal remedy simultaneously and publicly. A long silence settled over the county recorder's office. Holt looked at the documents for another moment. Then he looked at Milton with an expression that was not quite defeat, because men like Holt do not defeat easily, but was the expression of someone who has assessed the current position and found that the numbers no longer favor aggression. "We are done here," Holt said. And they were. Walking out of the county recorder's office into the September sunshine, Nora felt the specific physical sensation of something that had been held at a high tension for the past 2 weeks finally and completely releasing. It was not triumphant exactly. It was more like the feeling after a long storm passes, not joy but the cleaner version of relief, the kind that comes from a resolution that is actual and complete rather than merely hoped for. Milton stopped on the wooden sidewalk outside the recorder's office and stood for a moment in the sunshine, and she could see him making the same internal adjustment, the slow return from the focused emergency posture of crisis to something more ordinary and sustainable. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. It was the second time he had said exactly those words to her, but this time they had more weight behind them, the weight of everything that had happened in the 2 weeks since the first time, and she felt them accordingly. "You would have found it eventually," she said. "The fraud, perhaps," he said, but not before he had moved on the claim and not with the Abilene documentation. He paused. "You saved the ranch, Nora." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it the way you notice the first warm day after a long winter, not with surprise exactly, but with a recognition of something that has changed, and that the change is welcome. She thought about what to say. And then she thought about the fact that they were standing in the sunshine outside a county recorder's office in Cassidy Creek, Kansas, in September of 1882, and that she had spent 12 days in closer proximity to this man than she had permitted anyone in 3 years, and that the careful architecture of her defenses had not been breached by deception or manipulation or any of the things she had feared, but had simply, gradually, quietly been made irrelevant by consistent honesty and the particular quality of a morning's work shared in companionable silence. "Milton," she said, trying his name in return, and she watched something in his expression shift at the sound of it. "Yes," he said. Just that, but the yes had a fullness to it. "The school board position," she said. "I would like to discuss it formally." Something that was entirely a smile happened on his face, not the controlled flicker she had seen occasionally over the past 12 days, but an actual, unambiguous smile that changed the whole landscape of his expression and made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, entirely warm. "I will call on Mrs. Garland's tomorrow evening," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. They stood in the sunshine for another moment, and then they went their separate ways back into the ordinary life of Cassidy Creek, and nothing on the outside of either of them was different at all, but something on the inside of both of them had shifted irrevocably in the direction of each other. The autumn that followed was the best autumn Nora Harper could remember, though she told herself this frequently and with some suspicion, because she was still the woman who had been deceived by a charming man, and she did not intend to stop being careful simply because the warmth was pleasant. But Milton Fletcher did not require her to stop being careful. He called on her at Mrs. Garland's on the appointed Tuesday evening, and they sat in Mrs. Garland's front parlor, while Mrs. Garland made a performance of being entirely occupied in the kitchen, and they talked for 3 hours about the school board position and the state of education in Cassidy Creek and the novels of Charles Dickens, whom it turned out Milton had strong and specific opinions about. And by the end of the evening, Nora had accepted the teaching position, and they had made arrangements for her to begin in 2 weeks. He called on her the following Tuesday as well, and the Tuesday after that. The teaching was a revelation. The children of Cassidy Creek were no different in their essential nature from the children of Lawrence, wild and funny, and occasionally impossible and deeply earnest in all the ways that children are earnest before the world teaches them to be ironic. She had a dozen of them in the one-room schoolhouse, ranging from 6 to 14, and within a month she had established an order that was structured without being rigid and demanding without being unkind, and the children responded to it, the way children respond to genuine expectations, which is with a mixture of complaint and secret pride. Milton came by the schoolhouse sometimes in the late afternoon, when she was finishing up and the last children were leaving, and he would help her close up the building, carrying the water bucket and checking the windows against the coming weather, and they would walk out together into whatever the October light was doing, which was often something extraordinary. He told her about the ranch. Not the logistics of it, though he spoke of that too, but the deeper part. The part that was about what the land meant and what his father had built and what he intended to preserve. There was a history of the place in him that was not simply property ownership, but something more like stewardship, a sense of obligation to the land itself, and to the people who worked it and to the future that would inherit whatever he managed to make of it. She found this deeply, unexpectedly moving. It was so different from the way Daniel Cruz had spoken about his ambitions, all of it oriented toward his own advancement, his own satisfaction, with the world functioning as a backdrop against which his story occurred. Milton's orientation was outward. The land mattered. The work mattered. The people mattered. He was part of something larger than himself, and he knew it, and he did not resent it. She told him this one October afternoon when they were walking back from the schoolhouse, and the light was the particular amber of late October in Kansas, thick and warm and elegiac. He listened to her characterization of him with the attentive seriousness he brought to all observations, and then he said, "My father used to say that a man who only cares about his own story is a man living in a very small room." "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Nora said. "He died when I was 22, Milton said. There was grief in it, but not the raw kind, the kind that has been processed over years into something that can be carried without it being the thing you feel at every moment. He was a good man, fair and hardworking and not given to pretension. I have tried to be those things." "You have succeeded," she said, and she said it simply, because it was true and because he deserved to hear it. He looked at her sideways in the amber light and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I am going to say something that I want you to hear clearly and without the pressure of expectation." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to face her. "I am in love with you," he said. "I do not say this because I expect you to respond in kind immediately, or because I am placing any condition on what is between us. I say it because I am constitutionally incapable of feeling something this large and not telling you about it, and I thought you deserved to know." The amber light was everywhere around them, and the prairie made its vast quiet around them, and Nora Harper stood very still and let the words land without flinching. She had expected, when this moment came, which some part of her had known was coming, to feel the old fear. The contraction, the recoil, the sophisticated defensive machinery that 3 years of careful management had built and maintained and kept in excellent working order. What she felt instead was the specific gravity of something true. "I know," she said. "I have known for some time, and I am not afraid of it, which surprises me more than I can easily tell you." She paused. "I need more time before I can say it back with the certainty it deserves, not because I doubt you. Because I am learning to trust myself again, and that is slower work." He nodded as though this were entirely reasonable, because he was a man who found reasonable things reasonable without needing them to be otherwise. "I have time," he said. She looked at him in the amber October light and thought that this was what it felt like when something was real. Not the dazzling performance of romance that Daniel Cruz had offered her, all brilliant surface and hidden machinery, but this. A man standing in the prairie light telling her a true thing, and meaning exactly what he said about giving her time to find her way to the truth of her own feeling. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with the same steady quality with which he did everything. They walked back to Mrs. Garland's in the fading light with their hands intertwined, and Mrs. Garland saw them from the kitchen window and made a sound that was not quite a word, but expressed a complete and satisfied editorial opinion. November came and then December, and the Kansas winter descended with the particular ferocity it reserved for flat, open country, where there was nothing between the Arctic air and the plains except a few thousand miles of grass. The schoolhouse was cold in the mornings until Nora had the stove properly going, and the children arrived red-cheeked and blowing steam, and she taught them their lessons with the conviction that a warm mind was as important as a warm body. On a Friday evening in early December, after a week in which 3 separate storms had made the road between town and Anchor Creek essentially impassable, Nora sat in Mrs. Garland's kitchen drinking tea and arrived at the decision she had been approaching for weeks. She trusted him. Not with the naive totality of the younger self who had trusted Daniel Cruz, but with the evidence-based, eyes-open, daily renewed trust of someone who has paid close attention to another person across months of varying circumstances, and found them consistently to be exactly who they represented themselves to be. She trusted him and she loved him, and the difference between knowing this and saying it was only time and time had done its work. The next Tuesday evening when he called, she told him. She told him straightforwardly, the way he had told her, without ornament or performance, that she was in love with him, and that she intended to stop pretending otherwise to herself or to anyone else. He sat very still in Mrs. Garland's parlor for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me, if you are willing to consider it." She looked at him, and the warmth that had been building since that first morning at the workbench beside his table of documents was now simply the temperature at which she lived, the baseline, the ordinary condition of being herself in relation to him. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Mrs. Garland, who had been making an unconvincing performance of reading in the corner, made the same sound she had made at the kitchen window in October, and then she put her book down and went to put the kettle on, because this was a moment that called for something better than ordinary tea. They were married in February of 1883 in the Cassidy Creek Methodist Church, which was small and cold and had frost on the inside of its windows, and the children from the schoolhouse were there in the front pews in their best clothes, and Mrs. Garland wore her good dress and cried in a manner she would later describe as entirely dignified. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister, who was the same man who had spent the entirety of a church social discussing grain prices with Milton 3 years earlier, and who seemed genuinely pleased to see him standing at an altar for an entirely different purpose. Nora wore a dress that Mrs. Garland had helped her make from a deep blue wool that was the exact color of the work dress she had been wearing the first morning she worked at Milton's table, which was either a coincidence or was not. And she carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers, because the February plains did not offer much in the way of fresh blooms, but dried flowers were honest and lasting, and she had decided she liked that better anyway. When the minister asked if she would take Milton Fletcher as her husband, she said yes with the particular quality of directness she had been practicing for months, not the performed confidence of someone who has rehearsed, but the actual confidence of someone who knows what they are saying and why. When Milton said his vows, he said them the way he said everything, looking directly at her without deflection or social performance, and she felt each word as a separate weight of truth being placed carefully in her hands. After the ceremony, they drove out to Anchor Creek in the hired wagon through the February cold, with the prairie white and still around them, and the sky the particular pale gray of a winter day that has decided not to commit to any more weather. And when they arrived at the ranch, Nora looked at the straight, tight fences and the sound weathered buildings and felt the peculiar, quiet recognition of arriving somewhere you did not know was waiting for you. "Welcome home," Milton said. She looked at him. "Welcome home," she said back. Spring came to Anchor Creek with an extravagance that felt like the land making a point, the grass coming up green and dense, and the creek running full and fast, and the cottonwood trees putting out their bright new leaves like small green lights. Nora continued teaching until the school year ended in May, riding into town 4 days a week, and finding that the commute was pleasant in good weather and survivable in bad, and that the children were as willing to learn as they had ever been, and more so since several of them had made a project of leaving small gifts on her desk: a smooth stone, a feather, a carefully folded square of cloth, which she kept in a ceramic dish on the windowsill. Milton was expanding the herd that spring, which meant long days and a kind of productive exhaustion she found she liked watching in him. The way he came in from the fields in the early evening, with the specific physical satisfaction of a man who has done exactly the work he was built to do. They developed the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that she had not quite believed in before, the particular intimacy of breakfast at the same table, and the movement around a shared kitchen, and the conversation that was sometimes about substantial things and sometimes entirely mundane, and was valuable either way. She was 3 months along when she told him, which was July, and she told him at the breakfast table on a Sunday morning with the summer light coming in through the east window and the coffee going cold between them, because she had been trying to find the right words for 20 minutes and finally decided that the right words were simply the true words. She said, "We are going to have a child in January." He put down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read, which was unusual because she had become quite good at reading his expressions. Then he said, "January." And the word had the quality of a man testing whether it was real. "January," she confirmed. He got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting, and he took both her hands in his, and he stood looking at her with something in his face that was not quite any single emotion but all of them at once, arranged in an expression that she felt in the center of her chest like a struck bell. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, equally honest. "And completely overwhelmed by something else that is larger than the fear." She understood this precisely because she felt exactly the same thing. He sat down in the chair beside hers and kept hold of her hands, and they stayed like that for a while with the summer morning around them, and the coffee going completely cold, and neither of them finding this in any way unfortunate. The baby came on the 14th of January, 1884, during a prairie storm that made the midwife's journey from town a considerable adventure. And it was a boy, which Mrs. Garland, who had come out to help and had entirely justified this by being indispensable, declared was entirely appropriate for a first Harper Fletcher. They named him John, after Milton's father, with Nora's maiden name as the middle name, so he was John Harper Fletcher, and he was born with dark hair like his mother and gray eyes like his father, and an opinion about the world that he expressed at considerable volume from the first moment. Milton held his son for the first time with the same quality of complete attention he brought to everything, but amplified to a degree that Nora watched with a fullness in her chest that she thought might simply stay there permanently. He looked at the baby as though the baby were the most interesting thing he had ever encountered, and then he looked at Nora with an expression that she understood without words and returned without difficulty. The years that followed were not uncomplicated, because nothing in the territories was uncomplicated, and there were hard seasons and a drought in 1886 that tested the ranch severely, and a dispute with a neighboring property over water rights that required Milton's careful and determined attention, and Nora's increasingly seasoned opinion about the relevant statutes. There was a year in which 3 of their cattle hands left for the silver mines in Colorado and Milton, had to rebuild the workforce from scratch, which he did with the patient deliberateness she had come to know as the essential quality of his character. But through all of it, the difficult seasons and the good ones and the long, ordinary days that were neither dramatic nor negligible, but simply the substance of a life being lived, there was the specific quality of what they had built between them, which was not the dazzling performance of romance, but the actual thing, steady and renewable and deepening with use rather than diminishing. They had a second child in 1886, a boy they named Samuel, who arrived in a considerably more orderly fashion than his brother and who was born with his mother's dark eyes, and a temperament of philosophical calm that he appeared to have inherited from no one but himself. John Fletcher, aged 2, received his brother with an initial suspicion that gradually gave way, over several months, to a proprietary affection that he expressed by following Samuel everywhere and loudly narrating the world to him. Mrs. Garland, who had retired from the boarding house and was now living in a small house on the edge of town that Milton had helped her purchase, came out to Anchor Creek frequently enough that John regarded her as an additional grandmother, and Samuel, as he grew into language, called her Mrs. G, which she claimed to dislike and clearly did not. The school board replaced Nora when the boys were small, with her recommendation, and she spent several years devoted entirely to the ranch and her family. But in 1888, when John was 4 and Samuel was 2, the county opened a new school, and the board came to ask her formally if she would be willing to return to teaching. And Milton sat with her that evening while she thought about it. And when she asked him what he thought, he said what he always said when she asked him that question, which was that she knew what she needed and he would support whatever she decided. She went back to teaching. The morning rides to the schoolhouse became part of her rhythm, and the evenings when she returned to the ranch became the hinge of every day, the moment when the two halves of her life rejoined. In the summer of 1889, 7 years after Nora Harper had ridden into Cassidy Creek with 50 cents in her pocket, and 11 days later overheard a conversation in a livery stable that she chose not to walk away from, she sat on the porch of the Anchor Creek ranch house in the long July evening with her husband beside her, and John running in the yard with a stick he had decided was a horse, and Samuel sitting, very seriously, in the dirt making observations about ants. Cass Denton had left Cassidy Creek 2 years ago, destination unknown and not inquired after. Eli Holt had ultimately been investigated and fined, not imprisoned but significantly reduced, and had sold his freight operation and moved north, and the property he had tried to take from Milton was now bordered by the improvements of the past 7 years, fences and water improvements and a secondary barn, and was demonstrably, thoroughly Milton Fletcher's land. The evening light was the specific gold of midsummer in Kansas, long and warm and without any urgency in it, the kind of light that exists in a space outside of time. The prairie spread away from the porch in every direction, vast and green after a good wet spring, and the creek was running high and the cattle were fat on the good grass, and John's stickhorse had apparently developed a personality that required him to argue with it loudly in the middle of the yard. "I have been thinking," Milton said. "Yes," she said, and waited, because he was a man who thought things through before he said them, and the thinking was part of the saying. "I would like to add a room to the house," he said, "on the east side, a proper study with enough shelves for all of the books." She looked at him. Their combined library had, over 7 years of contributions from both of them, outgrown the current arrangement and was living in a state of creative disorder across 3 rooms and the top of the kitchen dresser. "I would like that," she said. "And I think," he said, with the slight careful quality he had when he was about to say something that mattered to him in a way that made him choose his words precisely, "that I would like to have another child." She looked at him in the evening light. She thought about this. She thought about the 2 boys in the yard and the years they had built, and the work that continued, and the life that kept expanding in directions she had not expected when she rode into this town with 50 cents and a satchel of someone else's secrets. "Yes," she said, "I think I would like that too." He reached over and took her hand the way he had taken it that October afternoon walking back from the schoolhouse 6 years ago, with the same steady quality, the same complete certainty, and she held it the way she had held it then, and had been holding it in all the ways that mattered ever since. John had given up arguing with his stick horse and had apparently declared peace, and was now cantering in a large circle around Samuel, who watched his brother with the philosophical patience of a 2-year-old who has concluded that the universe contains inexplicable things and that this is not ultimately troubling. "It is a good evening," Milton said. "It is," Nora said. And then, because she was still and had always been someone who said the true thing when she knew it, she said, "Do you remember the first morning I came to the ranch?" He turned to look at her. "I remember everything about it," he said. "You said," she told him, "that we had worked beside each other all morning without speaking, and that it was the best morning you could remember." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was receiving something, not as a pause before his response, but as genuine engagement with what had been offered. "It was true," he said, "and it still is." She looked at him in the long golden light with the boys in the yard and the prairie all around them, and the life they had built spread in every direction, and she felt the warmth that had been inconvenient in a livery stable in September of 1882, and had turned out to be the most reliable thing she had ever felt, which was love, actual love, the kind that did not require performance or maintenance of illusion, but only the daily renewable choice of honesty and attention. "There have been many best mornings since," she said. "There have," he agreed, "and I expect there will be considerably more." Samuel had stood up from his aunt observations and was making a dignified journey toward the porch steps with the specific gravity of a 2-year-old who has decided it is time to sit with his mother. Nora opened her arms as he climbed the step and settled him onto her lap, where he leaned back against her with the complete animal trust of a small child who has never had any reason to doubt that he is exactly where he belongs. John came galloping past the porch, stick horse at full speed. "John," Milton called. John pulled up, slightly breathless, hair wild, the stick pointed skyward. "Yes, sir. It is nearly supper time." John considered this with the deep seriousness of a 4-year-old evaluating competing priorities. Then he pointed his stick horse toward the yard one more time, completed a final circuit, and came in. The 4 of them went inside into the warm kitchen where supper was already on the stove, and the evening closed in around the house in the particular way of summer evenings on the Kansas plains, slow and warm and absolute, and the light went from gold to amber to the deep blue of a clear night coming on, and somewhere across the dark prairie the creek ran full, and the cattle moved through the good grass, and the Anchor Creek Ranch continued to exist as exactly what it was. The particular thing that can only be built through years of honest work and genuine attention, and the specific quality of love that is not diminished by being looked at directly. 3 months later, Nora told Milton at the breakfast table on a Sunday morning, the same way she had told him twice before, that they were going to have another child, and he got up and came around the table and took her hands, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen both times before, amplified rather than diminished by repetition, because some things in a genuine life do not wear thin with use but only grow fuller. The 3rd child, a girl, arrived in the spring of 1890, and they named her Clara, and she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and a disposition that combined Milton's steadiness with Nora's directness in a way that Mrs. Garland, who was there for the event and who had now been present for all 3 of them, declared was precisely right. John Fletcher, age 6, received his sister with an enthusiasm that was only slightly tempered by his clear expectation that she would be immediately operational. Samuel, age 3, sat beside his mother's bed and looked at the baby with the concentrated philosophical attention he brought to all new phenomena, and after several minutes of study, offered his considered verdict. "Small," he said. "Yes," Nora agreed. "Will she get bigger?" "Yes," Nora said. "All of us do." Samuel nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer as a statement of the general principle, and went back to studying the baby with the calm certainty of someone who has asked the right question and received a complete answer. The room smelled of spring, the windows letting in the particular clean smell of the Kansas spring after rain, and the prairie was green and running with new life in every direction. An Anchor Creek ran high and fast past the eastern pasture, and the ranch was alive with the sound of work, and weather and animals and children. And Nora Harper Fletcher lay in her bed with her daughter in her arms and her husband's hand in hers, and felt the full weight of a life that had not turned out the way she planned, and was better for it in every particular. She thought about the woman she had been in a livery stable in September of 1882, standing with oil-dark hands, and a secret she did not know she was carrying. And she thought about what that woman had not yet known about herself, that the careful architecture she had built to keep the world at a safe and manageable distance was not the protection she had believed it to be, but simply the structure she had built while waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone honest enough to make protection unnecessary. Outside the window, John was explaining something to Samuel in the yard, his voice carrying the particular conviction of a 6-year-old who has very recently learned a piece of information and cannot rest until it has been shared. Samuel's response was inaudible from the bed, but was apparently either insufficient or incorrect because John's explanation became more emphatic. Milton squeezed her hand. She looked at him. He had the expression she knew best of all his expressions, the one that was not quite a smile, but that contained everything a smile could convey, and then some. The expression of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and knows it. "Clara," she said, looking at their daughter. "Clara," he agreed. The spring light moved through the room, and the ranch went on around them, and the boys made noise in the yard, and Mrs. Garland could be heard in the kitchen making something that smelled of cinnamon and warm bread. And the life they had built from an overheard conversation, and a satchel full of secrets, and a morning of shared silence at a table full of documents was whole and complete and ongoing. And the best morning either of them could remember was not any single morning, but the continuous morning of choosing each other again, with full knowledge and full honesty in every day that followed. The trap that had been meant to take everything from Milton Fletcher had instead brought him the one thing his careful, deliberate, well-maintained life had been missing, and the dark past that had followed Nora Harper out of Lawrence had ultimately turned out to be not the defining thing about her, but only the road by which she arrived at the place she was always going. And outside, the Kansas spring continued its extravagant work, the grass coming up and the creek running and the sky doing things with light that had no adequate language, and in the rooms and the yard and the fields of the Anchor Creek ranch, the Fletchers, all 5 of them counting Mrs. Garland, who might as well have been family since she functioned as such in every important respect, continued the daily, unglamorous, sacred work of living together in full knowledge of each other, which is the only kind of love that deserves the name.